Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal, after a prolonged and deeply concerning absence from the screen of General Hospital, the name Kin Shriner, synonymous with the iconic role of Scotty Baldwin, began to raise waves of anxiety and speculation among devoted fans. For decades, Scotty Baldwin had been woven into the very fabric of Port Charles, a character whose legal maneuverings, moral ambiguity, and often unexpected compassion defined countless storylines. His sudden and prolonged disappearance from the show gave rise to whispers that perhaps Kin had permanently exited the series, whether by choice or circumstance. But the truth behind his vanishing act revealed something far more devastating, a personal health battle that nearly claimed his life, a grueling fight between survival and despair, and a powerful reminder of the resilience of an artist who refuses to surrender to fate. The crisis began quietly, nearly a year ago, with what was intended to be a routine ankle surgery. Kin Shriner had been struggling with the long-term effects of chronic arthritis, particularly in the lower bones beneath his ankle, which limited his mobility and caused significant discomfort. The initial surgery was designed to fuse these bones, a procedure often used to alleviate arthritic pain and restore functionality. Kin, like many in his situation, trusted the process, believing it would be the key to regaining full use of his foot and a return to normal life. But in a harrowing twist of fate, the operation turned into a medical nightmare. According to Kin's own recounting, the surgeon performing the operation made critical post-operative errors, either by oversight or negligence. The wound site failed to heal properly and became severely infected. Over the next several weeks, what began as a mild post-surgical complication rapidly deteriorated into a life-threatening situation. The infection spread deep into the surrounding tissues, causing necrosis in parts of his lower leg. Kin began to experience excruciating pain, and soon he found himself unable to walk or even move the affected leg. Simple tasks like eating or sitting upright became impossible without assistance. What followed was a swift and terrifying decline. The infection compromised his immune system, and he spiraled into a state of extreme fatigue and unconsciousness. His vital signs wavered, and within days he slipped into a semi-comatose condition. Doctors warned his family that his chances of full recovery were growing slimmer by the day. The man who once lit up television screens with his presence was now bedridden, nearly unresponsive, and fighting for every breath. For his loved ones, it was a waking nightmare. And yet, they refused to give up. His family scoured the country for answers. Specialists were consulted from Boston to Chicago. Experimental treatments were discussed, second opinions sought, and multiple hospitals reviewed his case. Each option came with its own risks, and none offered any guarantee of recovery. Still, they pressed on. Amid this desperate search for help, a beacon of hope arrived in the form of a longtime friend and former co-star, John Stamos. Having remained close with Kin through the years, John stepped in and insisted on transferring him to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, where he had personal connections and deep trust in the medical team. There, Kin was received by a highly specialized surgical unit. After a thorough evaluation, they determined that a second, more complex corrective surgery was necessary. This operation would involve the removal of dead tissue, debridement of the infected areas, and the careful reconstruction of damaged bone and soft tissue structures. It was a high-stakes procedure, but without it, the alternative was grim. The surgery was scheduled and performed over several painstaking hours. Thankfully, it was deemed a success. The infection was contained, and the structural integrity of his leg was preserved, but the road to recovery was only just beginning. Kin's body had been ravaged by months of immobility, antibiotics, and the brutal toll of infection. Now came the long and arduous path to rehabilitation. Every day, he endured hours of physical therapy, exercises so simple in theory, yet grueling in practice. He had to relearn how to bear weight on his leg, how to maintain balance, how to walk without collapsing from pain. The muscles in his leg had atrophied, and the nerves were slow to respond. Worse still was the lingering chronic pain that no medication could fully relieve. At times, it was so intense that he could hardly speak through it, yet he continued to push forward. The psychological battle was just as fierce. For an actor whose life had been defined by movement, expression, and performance, being confined to a hospital bed, unable to control his own body, was a cruel sentence. Doubts crept in. Would he ever walk again without assistance? Would he be able to return to work? Would he ever again portray the character that had defined so much of his life? Kin later revealed that during his darkest moments, it wasn't the fear of death that haunted him most, but the thought of being forgotten, of never again standing on a set, hearing action, and becoming Scotty Baldwin once more. But Kin refused to surrender. Inspired by messages from fans and the unwavering support of friends like Stamos, he committed himself fully to the process. Slowly, he began to regain control over his body. Small steps turned into short walks. Painful movements became tolerable. His therapists, impressed by his determination, pushed him harder, knowing he had a goal unlike any other, not just survival, but resurrection. Despite all progress, however, another shadow loomed. During a follow-up evaluation, doctors discovered that the damage had extended beyond bone and tissue. A nerve bundle near his lower spine, previously stressed by poor circulation and prolonged inflammation, was beginning to fail. Left untreated, it could lead to permanent paralysis of the lower limbs. The only option was a third surgery, one even more complex and dangerous than the second. This procedure would involve accessing a highly sensitive area, requiring precision at a level few surgeons could manage. Kin was told bluntly, the risk was high. He could lose the ability to walk forever. He could lose control of basic bodily functions. In rare cases, such procedures even result in death. Yet Kin agreed. He signed the consent forms with trembling hands, understanding the gamble he was taking. In a heartfelt video shared with fans on social media, he smiled faintly and spoke of the upcoming operation. His voice cracked with emotion, but his message was clear: I'm doing this because I still believe I have more to give. To this show, to this role, and to the people who've supported me every step of the way. As Kin prepares for this final, make-or-break surgery, the entire soap opera community has rallied around him. Cast members from General Hospital and beyond have sent public messages of encouragement. Longtime fans have flooded his social media with artwork, letters, and stories of how Scotty Baldwin changed their lives. For Kin, this outpouring of love has been nothing short of overwhelming. A reminder that even though his body may be broken, his legacy remains intact. And so, while the halls of Port Charles may remain quiet in Scotty Baldwin's absence, the promise of his return hangs in the air like a whisper. If Kin Shriner survives this ordeal, and if the universe is kind, then one day soon, he will walk back into that studio, perhaps a little slower, perhaps with a cane, but with the same fire in his eyes that first lit up television screens in 1977. He won't just be reprising a role. He will be proving, once and for all, that the human spirit, when fueled by love, memory, and purpose, can overcome even the deepest of darknesses. However, the road to recovery for Kin Shriner was far from over. Just when he had begun to regain limited movement and adjust to the excruciating daily grind of physical rehabilitation, new and far more alarming complications emerged. During a routine evaluation, a team of neurologists and orthopedic specialists uncovered that the damage sustained during his first failed ankle surgery had not remained localized to the lower extremity. Instead, it had extended upward, affecting his pelvic region and, more specifically, the nerve clusters that control movement, sensation, and autonomic functions of the lower body. The surgical trauma, combined with inflammation and restricted blood flow over time, had placed severe pressure on a critical bundle of nerves near his sacrum, leading to intermittent neurological failure. Symptoms that initially seemed minor, occasional tingling or numbness, rapidly escalated into unpredictable and violent muscle spasms, partial paralysis in his left leg, and a sudden inability to control balance. Kin found himself collapsing without warning, gripped by electric jolts of pain that rendered him immobile for hours at a time. Diagnostic imaging confirmed that the nerve impingement had reached a critical stage. The doctors explained the gravity of the situation in clinical but honest terms. If left untreated, Kin could suffer irreversible nerve damage, resulting in permanent paralysis from the waist down, chronic incontinence, and the complete loss of independence. Worse yet, any complications stemming from a failure in his central nervous system could potentially trigger a cascade of secondary problems, including life-threatening cardiovascular collapse. Faced with this harrowing prognosis, Kin underwent several rounds of consultations involving neurosurgeons, vascular specialists, and anesthesiologists. These weren't ordinary appointments. They were tense, hour-long conferences where medical diagrams were dissected, risks quantified, and surgical options explored in granular detail. The consensus among the experts was chilling. Kin's only viable path forward was a third surgery, one far more invasive and precarious than any he had undergone before. The procedure would involve navigating dangerously close to his spinal cord and surrounding vascular networks to relieve the compressed nerve roots and reconstruct any collapsed nerve sheaths. A fraction of a millimeter's deviation could mean the difference between full recovery and a life in a wheelchair, or worse. Kin was presented with the surgical waiver, a document laden with medical jargon and contingency clauses outlining the high-risk nature of the operation. He read it in silence. Then, slowly, he signed his name. It was not an act of blind faith, but one of deliberate courage. He knew the odds were steep, the consequences daunting, but there was more at stake than his physical well-being. In a short, heartfelt video later shared on social media, Kin appeared visibly thinner and exhausted, but spoke with clarity and strength. Sitting in a modest room, dressed in a hoodie and sweatpants, he addressed his fans directly. "I'm not doing this for me," he said, his voice tinged with both weariness and resolve. "I'm doing this for all of you who have stood by Scotty Baldwin through 5 decades. This character isn't just mine, he belongs to everyone who ever believed in redemption, in second chances. If there's even a sliver of hope that I can return to that stage, I'm taking it." But while Kin was preparing his body for another confrontation with the scalpel, he also had to come to terms with a more quiet, but deeply painful reality, the symbolic fading of his presence from the show that had defined his life. During his absence, the production team at General Hospital had reassigned his former dressing room to a new, younger actor, Jens Austin Astrup, who had recently been cast in the rising role of Kai Taylor. It was a practical decision, perhaps even a necessary one given the show's rotating cast and limited studio space. Yet for Kin, it marked a subtle but undeniable shift. It wasn't just a nameplate being swapped, it was a passing of the torch, whether intentional or not. His name, once etched on the walls of the backstage corridors like a badge of honor, had been removed, and with it, a piece of his legacy temporarily boxed up. Kin never publicly criticized the decision. He spoke of it only with grace, choosing instead to focus on his recovery and future goals. But for those who knew him, and for the fans who had followed his journey, the subtext was unmistakable. In his quieter moments, in between therapy sessions and surgical consultations, Kin was mourning the gradual erosion of something sacred, his place in a world he had helped build. He had spent nearly 5 decades walking the halls of Port Charles, memorizing scripts, slipping into character, delivering lines that etched themselves into daytime television history. To see that space occupied by another, however talented, was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet Kin responded the only way he knew how, with grit and grace. He did not post bitter rants, nor did he retreat into resentment. Instead, he reminded himself of what truly mattered. The body of work he had contributed, the fans who still remembered every twist and turn of Scotty Baldwin's storyline, and the legacy that would endure whether or not he ever walked back onto that soundstage. He poured that bittersweet energy into his recovery, telling himself that while he couldn't control the tides of time, he could still fight to stay afloat, and maybe, just maybe, swim back to shore. For Kin, this battle was never just about the physical. It was about identity, legacy, and purpose. It was about proving to himself, to his colleagues, and to his audience that he was not finished. That the artist still lived within the wounded man. That the fire had not been extinguished, only tested. And so, as he braced for the third surgery, the most dangerous of them all, he did so not with fear, but with a quiet kind of heroism. The kind born not of bravado, but of love. For a character, for a craft, and for the millions who had embraced him over the decades. In doing so, Kin Shriner affirmed what fans had known all along: he was never just playing Scotty Baldwin. He was Scotty Baldwin. And even as the scripts changed, the set pieces moved, and the cast evolved, the spirit of that character, flawed, fiery, enduring, would always carry his voice, his heart, and his fight. Kin Shriner's battle was never just against a medical condition. It was a confrontation with fate, a reckoning with mortality, and a test of everything he believed in as both an artist and a man. After nearly a year of excruciating surgeries, painful physical therapy, and emotional turbulence that pushed him to the edge of despair, one might assume that Kin's recovery had turned a corner. But fate had one more harrowing chapter left to write. While Kin had begun regaining partial mobility after his second surgery, lingering symptoms started manifesting in more insidious and terrifying ways. What initially appeared to be temporary numbness in his left leg began progressing into sudden, uncontrollable spasms. He would lose sensation below the waist for long stretches, sometimes waking up unable to move one side of his body or even feel his foot touching the ground. The most alarming sign came late one night when Kin collapsed in his apartment without warning. He lay on the floor, unable to call for help for hours, staring at the ceiling, unsure whether this would be his final night on Earth. When his medical team was alerted, emergency imaging revealed the worst-case scenario: the neurological trauma from the original botched surgery had caused severe compression of the lumbosacral plexus, a critical nerve network that branches out from the spinal cord and controls lower body function. This compression was not just disrupting mobility, it was damaging autonomic systems responsible for bladder control, digestion, and cardiovascular regulation. The diagnosis sent shockwaves through Kin and his family. The prognosis was terrifying. Without immediate surgical intervention, he faced not only permanent paralysis but also the possibility of organ failure from neural disruption. Time was running out. Within 72 hours, Kin underwent an exhaustive battery of tests: MRIs, spinal fluid extraction, electrophysiological studies. Neurosurgeons huddled in conference rooms at Cedars-Sinai with vascular specialists and high-risk anesthesiologists. The procedure they planned would require making a deep incision near the base of Kin's spine, delicately moving aside muscle, arteries, and ligaments to access the root of the compression. Any misstep could sever critical nerves or puncture the spinal cord. Hemorrhage, sepsis, cardiac arrest, the risk matrix looked like a checklist of nightmare outcomes. It was a surgery most patients would fear with every fiber of their being. But Kin, despite the pain, despite the fragility, chose resolve. This was not an elective operation, it was the final gate between him and a life of irreversible limitation. When the hospital's legal team presented Kin with the consent forms, the gravity of the situation was made painfully clear. He had to initial paragraphs that acknowledged he might emerge from the operating room unable to walk, speak, or even breathe without assistance. As he signed each page, he wasn't just authorizing surgery, he was confronting the very real possibility that he might not live to see another sunrise. Still, his hand didn't tremble. Later, a nurse who had been with him through both previous surgeries said it was the steeliest show of composure she had ever witnessed. When asked what gave him such strength, Kin reportedly said, "Scotty Baldwin's story isn't over yet. And neither is mine." But even as he steeled himself for the physical challenge, Kin was quietly grappling with a devastating emotional truth, that the world he once dominated might be moving on without him. His dressing room at the General Hospital studio, once personalized with decades of memorabilia, had been reassigned. The brass nameplate bearing Kin Shriner had been replaced with that of newcomer Jens Austin Astrup. The younger actor, now stepping into prominence as Kai Taylor, had been seen by fans as the new face of the next generation. For many, it was a symbolic passing of the torch. But for Kin, it felt like a slow erasure of legacy. He never lashed out or made accusatory statements. Kin had spent too many years in the industry to be bitter about change. He understood that production never stopped, that the rhythm of network television demanded a continual flow of characters, arcs, and new blood. Yet, how could one not feel the sting of displacement when their decades of service were being filed away into history while their bodies still fought to return? In a quiet social media post, Kin shared a photo of the new nameplate with a short caption. "Rooms can change, but stories live on." It was a poetic, restrained message, but fans knew it masked a deeper ache. He continued therapy each day with the grim knowledge that even if the third surgery succeeded, there was no guarantee the show would bring him back. Television is a fast-moving current, and long absences often spell the end of an era. But Kin wasn't driven by contract renewals or screen time anymore. He was fighting for something more profound. The right to reclaim his identity, to write his own ending, not to have it dictated by infection, bureaucracy, or aging. The fan response during this period was overwhelming. Messages flooded in not only from across the United States but from as far as Australia, the UK, and South Africa. Generations of viewers shared what Scotty Baldwin had meant to them, a rogue lawyer with a sharp tongue and a heart full of contradictions.